going?
It's going all right. I haven't practiced a lot these past few days, though.
Hey, that's a slightly better answer than the overwhelming majority of answers is I just haven't really been practicing in the past week. So, like, you guys got an assessment period or something, or
Yeah, we got a lot of just assignments and stuff going on right now, and I'm like,
yeah, yeah. There are definitely some stressful things associated with um, studying with an institution.
yeah,
And the weirdest thing is that like we kind of pretend that it's a part of study. Like it's somehow necessary. It's totally not. It's totally necessary if you want to get a whole bunch of people and put a number next to their name, but it's not really necessary for them to learn anything. So yeah. So like I feel your pain. It's one of the reasons why I kind of have very little impetus to go into institutionalized education anymore.
yeah.
I find that I learn faster and more thoroughly if I don't have a gun to my head. So,
Gosh.
All right. So,
Man.
when you are doing the practice, how's it going? What have you discovered?
So like, I haven't been like doing like like dedicated practice where I'm like doing my scales and all that recently. I've just been kind of more trying to write more things more recently.
Mm-hmm. So how do you go about that?
And what I've discovered is I can make like nice sounding like I can make stuff like that, but my problem is I can do that, but I can't write down what chords I'm playing.
Right. Do you mean you can't identify the names of them, or you can't write them in music?
Like I can like figure it out if I have my piano next to me and like figure it out. But then what I end up having problems is if I'm trying to write in a key signature.
I think you might just bump the gain though, because you are distorting like crazy at the moment.
Oh really? Oh, sorry. How about that?
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, sorry.
That's fine. Sorry, but the it is the it notation or is the it identification?
I think it's identification because like I can put down the notes, but then like, well, when I'm not writing down the notes, I'm just like playing the chord and piano. I have problems figuring out what key it is in relation to the key signature.
Right.
Okay. It'll be like, okay, I know what this chord is, but then it's not the right chord in the key signature. You know what I mean?
Okay. There's a lot of things that could be happening here. One of which is do your best at identifying those chords. So you got like a. Right. So it's stacked fifths.
Yeah, it's very much stacked fifths. Yeah.
Yeah.
Except for right at the end where it's like the octave in the middle. Yeah. Oh yeah, it is. Yeah, it is a fifth. Yeah.
The second last note. It's all stacked fifths, right? Well, this is where you're getting into harmony that you technically haven't studied yet, right?
That's what I don't know.
Stacked fifths is it's an avoid tone for music theory. I'm going to put that in bunny quotes for a second, especially as I was just before I logged in here, I was watching Adam Neely's thing on music theory and about how racist it is.
Yeah.
Because
it's all based in Western music theory, huh?
Well, yeah, but not just Western music theory, because remember, it doesn't even describe any of the jazz movement. Western music theory is the harmonic stylings of 18th century European people.
Huh.
Right? So there's a lot of rules and conventions that are present there that aren't necessarily relevant anywhere else. And aren't necessarily always relevant to modern music either. If you try to write out a lot of AC/DC songs with traditional music harmony and conventional ideas on how harmony should move, none of it will make sense. The perspective from which it makes sense on is, well, they're the open chords on the guitar. Right? So, like, it doesn't conform to the harmonic stylings of 18th century music players. So it's, it's not good music. Stacked fifths is one of these things that we're told to avoid, mostly because of the stylings of 18th century music performers or writers. Because it's a sound that is quite hard to write bass lines in, and for chords to have a certain texture that they didn't particularly find that appealing in those days. So that doesn't mean that's all of music theory. And there's famously Some Kind of Blue, the Miles Davis album, is using chordal harmony. So instead of stacking in fifths, you're stacking in fourths. Right? Like this. This is a C minor 11. I think it's a cool sound. I love chordal.
It's very jazzy.
Yeah, it's jazzy at the same time as having the vacancy of a suspended chord, right? It's a very different kind of jazz too. Quarterly, you'd have something like with the same kind of progression, and there's something that's more open in chordal harmony than there is in harmony that's traditionally stacked in thirds. You get less of those kind of dissonances. So straight off the bat, this. Oops, what were you doing? How'd you end up getting all of those? Oh, because you did a fourth to start it. Something like that, right?
No, I start on the D sharp, and it's just a long stretch.
Right. So you haven't got the bass one. Okay. So next step is, how do we identify what this is? Well, if we name it after D sharp, we've got D. Well, D sharp. Let's move it to D, so we don't have to think about sharps too much. Even more of a stretch. It's like the handbreaker was, slowly I get you to march it back towards C.
Go back to the bottom.
Okay, so we got D, we have the fifth, we have the second, and the fifth again. So what is a D chord, or what is any chord that has the first, fifth, and second in it?
Second. Is that a ninth? No, that's wrong.
No, it's not wrong, but a ninth would imply something else that this does not have. So a ninth is a tension that we add to a chord. So if we said D9 or D add 9, then we'd expect there to be a full D major chord, and there isn't.
Then add 9. Yeah, okay.
Right. So what we've got instead is a suspended chord.
Oh.
Because it's 1, 2, and 5, right?
Okay.
Okay. So it's actually not that. It's not that scary as a chord. It's this chord. But the way you've harmonized it makes it more interesting.
Because, so it's like, my problem with that, when I was writing it before.
Actually, these two fingerings do exactly the same thing. You're just dropping one of the notes. So if you do like this and avoid the G string, and you'd have exactly the same chord. And if you do include the G string, you'd have an extra root in there. So it's a complicated fingering way of playing that. Now, that doesn't mean that you should ditch the complicated fingering. But to start with, we've got a pretty normal chord. D sus. Well, D sharp sus. So I'm assuming from D sharp sus, where do you go?
So I go from this to...
So then you go to an F major.
Yes. Well, kind of.
thought it was more traditional than that. Okay, so you start on D sharp sus, and then you go to this chord. This is a D-shaped chord, like this.
Yeah.
Again, we're avoiding the 3. We're avoiding the color tone that tells us whether or not it's major or minor. We could imply it's major, though, for a couple of reasons. One of which is we've got this major 7th here.
Yeah.
So this would go.
Yeah, I realize that a lot when I'm
5,
trying to play
7.
chords on guitar and then putting them onto piano. Because a lot of the chords, they start off like the 1, 5, and the octave. And I'm like, well, there's no 3, so what the hell's going on?
It's a dyad. It's what we call a power
dyad.
chord on guitar terms. We'd call that a power chord. However, it's a dyad. That's the more technical music way of explaining it. We've only got 2 notes. We've got 1, 5, and 1. Here we have 1, 5, 1, and major 7, which I swear is a chord from Adam's song in Blink-182. I don't know why. It's a very specific tone memory all of a sudden. Okay, so this is this chord, right? So we've gone right, like a sharp major 7. So if we're in D sharp, that was A sharp major 7. Still don't know what our key is yet technically, right? Because that's a 5th movement, right? Yep, it's moving by a 5th. But normally the 5th would have a dominant 7th in it, according to the harmonic stylings of 18th century European musicians. And according to the scale, like if you're using a major scale, which we don't know yet, if you're using a major scale to construct this note here is not really present there. All right. There are other things this could be though. So what's the next chord?
So what's interesting, because it's just the same chord but a different voicing.
And that one really yeah, and this one really spells it out. This is an F chord. Right. So there's 2 ways of thinking about that. You could do say D sharp to a G sharp dominant, G sharp major 7 to an F. And those 2 chords sound very similar because they share a lot of tones in common. Right? But we are doing the infamous box step of music. You wouldn't happen to go here next, would you?
Oh no. I was like hearing it coming, I'm like, no.
Yeah.
So it goes, but it goes down.
Right. And this one's straight out obvious because if you've done all your triad studies, like you're supposed to, we got G minor here. It's a G minor triad.
Yeah.
With a 7 on top. It's G minor 7.
G minor 7, yeah.
Right. Okay, so we have some chords now. We've got some kind of D sharp, so I'll play this power chord. Some kind of A sharp, some kind of F, and then some kind of G minor. That's a pretty famous chord progression. Right, so that's actually makes a great deal of sense harmonically. We're in the key of A sharp. What we do is we start on the subdominant, we start on the 4 chord. That's why the major 7th makes sense, or the add 9 sus because you're not playing a 3rd. Then we come into the 1 chord, which makes sense for being a major 7. 1 technically according to the key is the major 7th. Then we move into your next chord was a B flat.
Yeah.
So that's the tonic, right? I thought you were playing this.
Oh no, it's
right. So it's you really spell it out there. So what you're doing is going D to B flat, major 7 to G minor.
yes.
Right. And that's fine because what we're doing is going 4, 1, 6.
Okay.
Which is 3 of the 4 chords of pop. All right. This is not to disparage anything, obviously, because like what I find endlessly fascinating is how voicing and how style affects those 4 chords to make them sound like millions of different songs that at a first glance you'd be like, I don't know, that doesn't sound the same.
Yeah, it's like if I play the same chords but like change how I like play it. It sounds like J-Rock.
Yeah. And look, the thing that makes this particular set of chordal arrangements interesting is the voicings you've used. You use a lot of voicings that naturally flow into one another, and that creates a lot of interesting harmonic scenarios. It creates a lot of difficult scenarios for guitarists because guitarists tend to need voicings to be what we call drop 2 inversions. So drop 2 is where you take the middle voice out. So we normally say go 1, 3, 5. Or you take 3 and you move it up an octave. 1, 5, 3. So this is 1, 5, 3. This is 1, 5, 3. So if you look at your E shape and your C shape, they're drop 2 voicings. And the cool thing on the guitar about a drop 2 voicing is there's a string you're skipping. And on that string, you can put some kind of extension. Like you could put a 6, right? You can put a major 7, or another root if we just want to fatten up that rooty sound, or, you know. Yeah, flat 9. Gotta learn to love them, man. They sound so cool. Right, like fancy kind of other. Speaking of non-Western ideas, although flat 9s are used all the time in Western music, but in that particular field, they feel very Moorish or very Spanish, maybe a little bit Arabic, and they're very cool. Like I'm using Phrygian dominant as a way through that.
Yeah, Phrygian and Dorian is very like
dominant. Phrygian dominant. We take a Phrygian scale and we take the third and we make a major.
Gotcha.
So instead of being a minor third, it becomes a major.
That sounds very foreign. Sorry.
Yeah, it totally does. In the same way that double harmonic major sounds really foreign too. Like double harmonic major's got can I remember? Is it? Sorry, it's major. Something like that. Yeah. So there are cool scales and there are cool other things to look at. What you have done is composed a conventional piece. Which is fine. The trick is, did you know how we got there? And I used a lot of very guitar-specific tricks to get there. One of which was identifying intervals on the fretboard. Right. So like this guy here is a 5th. So anytime you see that shape, you know it's a 5th.
Yeah.
Anytime when you see the next one, that's a 3rd, so that'll be a 4th. And then anytime it's kind of straight across, it's a 4th. You've got 3rds and minor 3rds, right? So the more you can study those, the easier it is to just look at your fingers and go, oh, that's a 5th, that's that, that's this, that's that. From there, it's pretty easy to break it into like, okay, so is the first one? Just starting with that. Well, you know, for instance, that this is a power chord.
Yeah.
So if that's a power chord, and you know that power chords are root, 5th, root, well, what's a tone above the root? The 2nd degree of the scale. Tone above the root. And then you think, we've got to go a 5th above. Now, one way of figuring that out would be, instead of going, find it on another string that's less complicated to play. But you also identified earlier, it's an octave from the 2nd note. So whatever we identified the 2nd note to be, you go, oh, it's the same as that. So therefore, I don't have to redefine that again. I've already defined it. It's 1, 5, and 2. So one of the things that is really good to get used to is a knowledge of these interval shapes on a guitar. Right? One of the cool things about guitar is that you don't have to solve the problem with letters.
It's like figuring out all the octave shapes, like the
yeah, just like figuring out. Yeah, one of those as well.
There you go.
So, like, one of the cool things about guitar is that you can do it pictographically, right? Like, you look at your fingers and you're like, that looks like something else I know. If I thought it was something else I know, how have I changed it? What was that note? Okay, now it's this, right? Which is exactly what we just did there. This shape, or really this
all
shape,
fits.
right? You know, you go, well, hold on, here's a power chord, and I've moved the tonic, the root note, up 2 frets. Well, if it's a power chord, right? Well, that's 1-5-1. 1 up 2 frets, that's a 2. Major second.
1.
So this is a dyad with a major second in it. What do we call a dyad with a major second in it? It's a sus chord.
Right? Sus.
Yeah, it's a bit suspect. So that's how I would start going around it. Again, with the second chord of the song, right? As soon as you played that, I'm like, because I couldn't quite see where your fingers were, I thought it could be this, right? Which means there would be some kind of F sus. Or when you pointed it out, I'm like, no, actually, I can hear that. This is a D chord, right? So D bar chord shape has a fret gap.
Gotcha.
Right? Before you see the familiar D shape. Now, what's happened here is we've taken a D shape and we've moved the root note down a fret. All right, see how we get there? D shape, move down a fret. That means that it's going to be some kind of major 7 chord because the fret down from the root is your major 7.
Yeah.
Right? So you can kind of solve these by what does this look like?
Okay.
And it's kind of hard to explain to other musicians. It's really, really effective at talking about guitar and other pattern-based instruments. But if you talk to a pianist about this, they're
not gonna know what the hell going on.
Yeah, they talk about shapes in music, in the notation of music, which I've only kind of recently started understanding what they mean by that.
What do you mean as in shapes in like music?
Well, for like a lot of times when you're reading chords in music, you don't read every note in the chord.
Oh yeah.
You have pattern recognition. So one of the first place you'll get an idea of that is in reading, say, the triads.
The snowman shapes, and then like the one with the.
Yeah, so 3 in a row is 1 off by itself as first inversion, 2 off by itself as second inversion.
Yeah.
So that makes it very quick and easy to read that. You're like, oh, I know what that is. And the strange thing about guitar is you're like, oh yeah, I know what that is. That's in 4 different places. But beyond that point, the more you read for a repertoire, the more likely you are to be able to just see a chord. After, it probably doesn't happen to me anymore because I haven't been reading classical guitar music in a long time. And
I've been thinking recently if I want to should I start practicing reading sheet music?
Look, it is something you wouldn't regret doing.
Yeah. Because I'm looking at like good books to get into, just start learning it. Because I want to. It seems like a good skill, but I'm also like, do I want to?
No, I understand the battle. The biggest point, and the point of actually today's lesson, because the actual content of today's lesson is this reading exercise, which turns into an improvisation exercise, is you have to support your reading with your technical knowledge. If you see a song that's in the key of B flat, the first thing you should do before you play anything in that song is go, oh, I know the B flat.
B flat.
So if something moves in stepwise motion, it moves that way. Right? So like at a certain point when you're reading music, you don't even need to actually know what the note is. Fixation on this note value is like a thing to grade kids with, just to make sure they know what they're saying. If you see something that starts on B and it moves in stepwise motion by 3 places, I didn't need to think about those notes. I just need to follow my scale fingerings. And that's one way of really speeding up your reading and treating music on a page in a very different way. Um, I was taught to get really, really, really stressed out about every single name. And it was virtually impossible for me to get to a stage of sight reading.
Yeah, what I realized when like you read sheet music, I was doing this last time we had an exam,
Yeah.
is I wasn't reading the notes, I was just reading the scale degrees.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is not in any way a bad way of reading music. In fact, it's probably a quicker and cleaner way of reading music than really getting stressed about the notes. We don't have to get stressed about notes. Working in scale degrees is much easier for instruments that are pattern based like ours, because this and this on this instrument share a hell of a lot in common, right?
Yeah.
That's not true on saxophone. That's not true on piano, right? The shapes of scales are all very different, but for us, it's not. So if you have, in this key, well,
Yeah.
if you read that in scale degree, then you'll be able to transpose it to here very easily. Whereas if you get really stressed out about, oh my god, what are the notes of this?
Yeah, then you're gonna be like, what the
It's going to
hell am
slow
I
you
thinking
down.
about?
It will slow you down. The other thing so if you're going to learn to read music, my number one piece of advice was take up classical guitar. Classical guitar has just so many valuable lessons that are very, very hard to learn anywhere else because of their focus. I think every genre, like across my life, I've done dips into pretty much every genre I've come across. And every single genre can teach you something in either a more digestible or a more obvious way than some other genre. And classical music, classical guitar music at the very least, what it can teach you is expression and understanding a melody. Of course, it teaches you understanding a melody from the perspective of 18th century European people. But that is a very powerful tool. And one of the reasons why I think courses still hit 18th century music theory so hard is that its format and function, the way it works, is very teachable for one thing, and two, can give you access to this idea of how to make, say, a melody tie itself off. Why is it that this melody speaks these chords? Especially if largely what you listen to these days, which I don't think is you necessarily, but is a lot of like tech metal.
No.
These kind of modern genres focus mostly around playing technique, I think, and less around playing technique and tone, and less around note choice.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stuff in there that are essentially dazzling non sequiturs. They don't necessarily make what I would think of as nice sounding music. And I know that nice is not always the point. I'm using nice here as
in relation to like old music theory, that's like that nice. Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, I don't even necessarily think it's that, because I think a lot of music that does not use Western music theory sounds
Yeah.
really nice. I really like some Indian sounds. I really like some Middle Eastern sounds, Egyptian sounds. They don't even use the same scales. They don't even conceive of music in the same kind of way, right? Like, and I still think they sound nice.
20-tone temperament.
Yeah. The thing that I think that tech players get stuck in is that they work very hard at their technique, and they let their fingers dictate their lines, which means that
like Satriani and all that, yeah.
Well, less so with Satriani. I would think more like Tosin Abasi.
Oh yeah.
Right?
What was it, thumping?
Yeah, and a lot of the players that do a lot of the kind of the tapping music and stuff, like
What's that called now? Like math rock?
yeah, that kind of stuff. Now, to a certain extent, that's entering into the popular consciousness, and it is not the first time. Look, if you really think about a lot of the say the blues and rock music from the 70s, there is a lot of players' fingers dictating their lines. In many ways, I think there's vestigial hang up from that stuff, And a lot of that stuff I still really love, but that's partially because those players were so poorly informed that they were still making oral decisions. So good players harmonize and work with whatever is going on at the same time. And there are multiple places in a lot of this modern metal stuff where the lines they play say nothing to do with the chords. So you could separate the two things and reorchestrate them in totally different ways. And you'd it would probably make more sense to reharmonize what was going on based off the notes they're choosing. And that is something that is not common in most music styles. I'm not a fan of like 12-tone row music, or generally, I'm sure that someone could compose something that's nice in that, or that weird German opera that I can't remember the name of, but just sounds like people screeching. Musical forms that are inherently dissonant. Although I don't even like saying that necessarily, because I like a lot of really dissonant music. It's just how that dissonance is used, and whether or not the only thing you do is dissonance. I like there to be some kind of connection between, say, the melodic line and the harmonic line, and not to have the melodic line be a way of people demonstrating to me all of their scale exercises. I'm happy for there to be some scale exercises involved, because obviously anytime someone does a fast run, that's essentially a scale exercise.
Yeah.
But you've got to come in and out of that scale run in a way that makes sense harmonically to what's going on. And I don't think that happens a lot in some of these more modern, metal-based genres. Pop music, on the other hand, is going in totally the other direction, where it's like getting simplified to the point where it's being crazy consonant. It's like highly catchy, highly predictable, not very many chords.
4 chords, you can know where it's going.
Yeah, 4 chord loops.
It's funny, like listening to like a popular song and then like knowing where it's gonna end up.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think that's bad, but I also think that has a certain nursery rhyme quality to it. You see the start of a nursery rhyme and you know where it's going to end up. Essentially, a lot of that is musical taste too, because I wouldn't go so far as to say that the stuff that doesn't make what I would think of as musical non sequiturs aren't necessarily musical.
Mm-hmm.
Like music is wide enough for me and all of that stuff. But I think it's a bit of a mistake, and the more people entrain to that kind of thing, like the way that people are entraining to perfect pitch, they're like people who entrain to perfect pitch are placing expectations on the human voice that kind of can't be achieved naturally. So there's this kind of slightly ersatz quality to it. Anyway, I should probably actually push on with the actual lesson topic.
Yeah, it's been like 30 minutes. We haven't actually done the lesson. That's fine.
I think you've learned some stuff.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, try and get yourself to put a connection between the stuff that we've been talking about and the music you're writing. I think is really important, right? It's a shame that I don't get to see you guys for a second year, because that's kind of what I would really like to do in a second year.
Oh, we don't have a second year?
No, not with me. You've got 4 years or 3 years for this. But I've got to try to condense everything I want to say in a year, so that's meant that I've cut out everything that's specific, right? Like, pretty much this whole year's course has been, this is crap you need to learn in order to understand the guitar neck. And I've left off any idea of genre or or how you necessarily get closer to applying these things. I would say that a lot of the questions today with your pieces could have been answered with that thoughts to guitar shapes, like the cage system, or triad shapes.
Yeah.
One of your chords is a triad shape, right? Extended to a 7. The last one, G minor.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
That's a closed voice, we would call that. Closed voice, G minor 7. Closed voice because they go all in order, 1, 3, 5, 7.
Yeah.
Right. Now, an interesting thing I think for you seem to like a lot of closed voices, would be to experiment with open voice. So open voice is, instead of going, it was just kind of what we were talking about before, drop 2. So if you might say take, instead of going G, right, in, so much distortion. We go 1 5. Yeah, sometimes when they play the guitar, I think there must be like a mic thing coming up and down, and like it gets shocked. So anyway, if we have this G chord, right, 1 3 5 1. If we instead structure that 1 5 3.
Yeah.
This is what we then call an open voicing. Right, so we get this, and then we get this. Here's another G open voicing, right? Now, the thing to think about with open voicings, yeah, we've got 3 roots and then a 5th here. Same as that.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing to think about with open voicings is that the distance between the notes are really wide, and that tends to make them feel very open feeling, whereas closed voicings tend to make them feel a little close. They tend to make them feel very close together, kind of warm and fuzzy. Whereas the same chord,
it feels very wide.
Yeah. And I think compositionally, that would be a fun thing for you to play with. You like closed voicings and contrast. Like, you've always got to think of elements of contrast in your music. That's usually what makes music more engaging and more interesting. So you might say have a whole bunch of closed voicings for the first chord loop, and then do a whole bunch of open voicings for the second chord loop. You might have like a breakdown that starts using a lot of open sounds because it makes everything sound big and wide, whereas everything you've played so far has this kind of warm and together feeling. This is how you can use some of your theory concepts to like give you ideas on composition, things to experiment with. Okay, so open up the sheet for today.
Yep, I have it open.
Okay.
Which one? The one that you sent last night, or the one that we missed?
The one. Oh right. Yeah. Sorry, we're actually not doing the lesson I thought we were doing. We're doing the other lesson. What was that?
Chord progressions you need to know and recognize.
Oh, fantastic! That actually kind of
goes into what we were doing today. I think that's why I wanted to bring it up, because I saw this last week and I'm like, oh, it kind of goes with what I was doing before.
Okay. So these chord progressions you need to know and recognize. You need to
1 4 5.
Yeah, 1 4, 1 5, 4 4 minor. These are things that I hear all the time in music from anywhere in the last 600 years, kind of thing. Like, it still kind of shocks me how much you kind of, oh wait, that's that chord progression, right? The important thing for you as a musician, and this isn't like, it's not a comprehensive list. This is literally, I sat down. Normally what I do to come up with these lessons is I for about a week in between the lessons, I'm playing around with different concepts of what kind of thing should I go to next in order to help give you more work to think about your triads, to think about your scales. So I'd sit down for 2 or 3 hours and I'd just write down a sheet. So this is just off the top of my head, things that I keep hearing all the time, still in popular music. So what you need to do is be able to know these progressions well enough to be able to identify them by ear. And they're also exactly the kind of exercises you should use to come up with things to practice with your scales and your arpeggios. The more of that you do, the easier and easier it's going to be to compose. Right? Because effectively what you're doing is a composition exercise every time you sit down to practice your scales. For example, in a very basic way, 1 to 4, right? So we could think about this as a triad. all I'm doing there on the DGB strings is constantly using different orchestrations of C triads and F triads. That's all I was doing, C and F, C and F, C and F, right? That's a great exercise. The thing I would challenge anyone to do is to make it sound like music. Don't try to go... I mean, you might need to start here. Right, just to make sure you know where everything is. But I think you can push that idea much further. That's kind of like
I think you were talking something about like something like this a while back. We were talking about like being able to recognize the two, like the one or how that fits together on the scales. So recognizing chord changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then we were explaining like, oh, all these chords fit into this one like scale degree.
Yeah. Well, the one scale, right?
One scale, not scale degree, just one scale.
So like if you have the 1, 4, and 5 chord, you can harmonize every note in the scale. Right? So like if we just take this, that's next week's, the next lesson, right? C, D, E, F, G, right? C is a C, which is the 1 chord. D is from G, the 5 chord. E is from C, the 1 chord. F is from F, the 4 chord. G is from both G, the 5 chord, and C, the 1 chord. What about 2? A. A is from the 4 chord. B, 5 chord, back to C, the C chord. So we can play our scale harmonizing. So this top line is the scale. All right, and here's all of them harmonized. So with that means that any melody like using the major scale, you could make a song with just chords 1, 4, and 5. Now beyond that point, you can even, if you think of substitution rules, you can also say, well, the 4 chord and the 2 chord are kind of the same thing anyway. There's only one note difference. That's a 1/6 relationship between major and minor. And the 5 chord and the 3 chord are essentially the same thing as well. Right? Because if you think about it, right, we've got F in this key, in the key of C, F and D minor, right? Well, that's 1 and 6 in the key of F. It's also 4 and 2 in the key of C. Relative major, relative minor. Okay, G and E minor. Well, that's 1 and 6 in the key of G, but it's also 5 and 3 in the key of C. Right? And you know as a guitarist, like, what's the difference between relative major and relative minor? Someone says, I'm in the key of G minor, and you're like, great, B flat major, let's go.
Because you can play them the same, yeah.
Yeah, because you play them the same. You resolve in different ways between the two chords because they have slightly different things, but slightly different notes in them. But, it's like this. A movement so bland, the AMEB says it's illegal for you to sing harmony studies. 1 to 6, right? And that's because the only difference between the 6 and the 1 is one note.
Phenomenal.
Right? So by that stage, if you can harmonize everything with 1, 4, and 5, you're like, or if I wanted it to be a little darker, I could use 2 instead of 4 and 3 instead of 6. And the only thing that's left then is 7, which is the only chord we haven't thought about. And 7 is the same as a 5 chord in inversion as a 9th. Right, so B minor 7 flat 5 is a G9. And we can hear that really clearly if I put a G in the bass of a B minor 7 flat 5. Right? So in a blues, you'll often hear this kind of thing.
Reminds me a lot of John Mayer.
But what we're doing there is everything's rooted on G because the bass player is probably right. We're sliding between the 7th, the 9th, and the 5th, all the way up to the root, the 3rd, and the 6th, and back down again. So we're doing G9 to G13 and back to G9. And this is the bread and butter of that, right? You've only got one extra note here, this B, but the B is the third of the G chord. So the 7 chord is, according to some angles on music theory, the 5 chord, the dominant chord, in inversion with an extension, with 2 extensions.
Yeah, that's why you can when you're reharmonizing, you can swap the 5 and the 7 around, and it makes sense because a lot of the notes are the same. I think I realized that before, where I was like, wow, this is the same chord, but like different sounding.
And look, next time you're playing a blues, right? Remember this relationship, right? This root note over here compared to this chord shape. Someone's like, oh yeah, we're just playing a blues, right? The other guy will probably be doing this. You should do that. Don't double up his chord. Just imagine your root note over here. So if we were doing a 12 bar in A, right? Here's A, so the chord goes here. Back 1 fret, yeah, because it's 1 fret higher on the low string, right? So we get like A, and then we need a D, and then an E. They sound much hipper. So for a 12 bar in A, you do here, and then you go to the 9th fret because the D is here on the 10th. And then for an E, for the 5 chord, you're up at 11 because the root is on 12. Right? Cool, but just really cool ways of using that kind of 7th relationship. Now, won't always work. Sometimes you don't want your 5 chord to be dominant 7th and a 9th, dominant 9th chord, right? And in those instances, it's not going to sound so hot. It will probably sound a bit weird. For example, if we're in minor keys. Now this is a chord progression we're about to talk about. Alright, now we're doing a 2-5 turn. That minor 7 flat 5 sub, that same thing. We're doing a G, making a G 9-7. Does not sound cool. Right? Sounds off. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't fit into there.
What it should be is this.
And it resolves better.
Yeah, and that's because the 9th on a dominant chord should be a flat 9 in minor keys according to the scale. So by putting in that 9th, it's like, oh, no, that doesn't sound so great. So there is always this rule of probably want to check your scale first. And that will only let you create diatonic music, which is not necessarily a great thing either. There will be lots of instances where things outside the key will sound cool, so you want to try it. However, at this moment in the music, I think this comes back to, remember what I was saying about chords create more or less tension, right? Like, so you want to make a minor chord less tense, you make it a minor 7. Well, in many ways, this G9 is less tense than this G flat 9. And usually, the dominant chord is to ratchet the tension up. And in a minor key, what we've effectively done is make the 5 chord that's supposed to ratchet our tension up to come back to 1 less tense. So we've made it worse at its job, which is why it kind of feels weird. Okay, so the chord progression that I've been getting everyone else to take a look at, because this is a lot of fun, again, as an improvisation exercise. Now I'm a broken record about this stuff. Is if you take a blues, right? We've got the 1 chord for maybe too much time. We just sit here for ages. And then we go down to 4, right? So we have this idea where on the 1 chord, for a large block of time, and we are shooting towards that 4 chord.
Mhm.
One way of dealing with the scenario, one way that a lot of musicians over the years have come up with is, okay, we can't change the chord. It's got to be C minor still. What can we do to create interest? Let's put a line in it. So if you scroll down the page, this is what we're going to have a look at, is the descending minor line cliche. So it should be under line cliches. There's the major one, the major cliche. In the major form, it sounds like, I think, like Chicago, like where someone's talking. You know, it's like, she was a dame and walked to my office. I had no idea that her blue eyes and gray hair was gonna.
It was Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah, you know what I mean. So like, it's the vamp music. So like in a lot of times
Yeah.
musical, they're like vamp on G, and that's what they mean. Is this line cliche? However, if we do that same line cliche on a minor chord,
James Bond.
James Bond, right? Now, all of these cliches are things that are found all the time. And why do we use them? Well, we're sitting on one chord and we want to create some goddamn interest because it's kind of a little dull. So the one that I think is you'll hear a lot more of, even today you'll hear a lot more of, is the descending minor line cliche. And what we're going to do is start on the root note of C. And we're going to walk chromatically down all the way back to G. But we're going to go C, C minor major 7, because that's the major 7, C minor 7, C minor 6, F minor, this is the third of F minor. Then let's say we go back to C. All right, so if we put that into context, I'm going to play around the first 1, 2, 3, 4 notes. I'm going to play just C minor. F minor. Now, that's what you would normally hear after the F minor in, say, a jazz standard, is doing 2 5. Right, so 2 in a minor key is the 7 in a normal key. So we're doing a D minor 7. And then we'll go to the 5 chord, and I think in this kind of feel, having the 5 chord as 7 augmented. Right, so I'm going 3x3 4. Right, so that's 1 flat 7 root sharp 5 based off an E shape, right? Then we come back to 1. So first step, let's play the progression. So you got to try to get your fingerings around doing that chromatic line.
What?
Yeah, I think you didn't move your pinky.
I don't know which chord I'm meant to be playing.
Oh, there you go. Yep. Then we want to go back another step.
Whoa.
No? So you keep it on C minor. It's still on C minor. C minor major 7. This G string note's got to go down another fret, C minor 7. Good. And then we get C minor 6. Now, if you're particularly adventurous, you'll finger it like that.
That's how I would have done it if I don't know how to do anything else.
Yeah, this is not like it's a shape that a lot of people find awkward, but when you start doing 4 chord, 4 note inversions on the guitar, they get much freakier than this. So it's not necessarily a bad one. I quite often I drop out the 5th. You know, if you can lose anything, you can lose the 5th or the root. I just play the root 3rd and 6th here. Depending on what mood I'm in, sometimes I quite like the odd fingerings with the 5th staying.
Well, I guess it kind of feels natural going from this.
Yeah, you just missed one step. You want the 7 in front of that. So.
Oh yeah, that's why I was going.
All right, so all of the names of those chords. Remember, you got to remember the names. C minor. I'm sure you know that one. C minor major 7. So C minor chord with the 7th major scale. C minor 7. That's C minor 6.
So
And then we go to F minor.
C minor, major 7?
Yeah, C minor major 7.
And C minor 7.
Yep.
And then this is
C minor 6.
Oh.
Minor 6.
Minor 6, whoops.
Yep. And then we go to F minor. I'm doing F minor 7. Now, normally in most songs where you hear this progression, you'll go to a 2-5. So, one more fret. Yep. Okay, so play the progression a few times. It's very, very, very distinctive orally. You know, it's also Michelle by the Beatles and a whole bunch of other songs. So double up the length of the F. Cool. Okay, so the reason I picked on this chord progression, I think in the other classes we took a look at some of the first 5 on the sheet or something. Something you should definitely do is make sure you take a look at the progressions. But with the other ones, you know, just playing your triads, trying your pentatonic scales. You know, you got to think from C to F. Then maybe you do C pentatonic to an F pentatonic. Just worrying about getting between, say, 2 pentatonic scales or 2 arpeggios. With this one, there is a really, really distinctive line inside of those chords, the one we've created, right? Right. So what we can do is use that as a kind of a melody that we play an improvisation around. We've got to keep coming back to that in wherever we're playing on the neck, but we could just use pentatonic and blues around that to make some cool melodies. So.
That's the kind of thing you play if you want to look cool playing guitar, sound really cool.
It does sound really cool. It teaches us something really interesting about harmony lines, right? If you come up with a note from each chord that you think sounds really good when you string them together, you can use that as a framework for improvisation and keep using that in all the different places on the neck and come up with a whole bunch of different sounds. Here's another one. Yeah. Right?
Even though I know it's like a cliche thing, I can't help but like keep thinking in my head like, wow, this sounds so familiar. Even though I know it, yeah, oh no, shit, it's familiar.
Yeah. On top of that, I think it starts showing that there's a lot of range inside of that chord progression, right? Like when you're up the top and doing that kind of stuff, it sounds really delicate, fragile almost. Down here, there's like a much more kind of down-home bluesy kind of quality, and in the bass, you know. Right.
I want to hear that on like a bass guitar.
Yeah, like it sounds pretty hip, and like it has this very cool groove. It's very easy to sit in. So as an improvisation exercise, give it a go. You've got this chromatic line, right? And you've got your pentatonic scale. All you need to do is play around with the pentatonic scale in between each of those notes.
Nah.
So, okay, don't start with the chord. Start with just the note from that line. All right. So, do you know your pentatonic notes around here?
Nope.
It's what I would call box score pentatonic.
Yeah, usually I should be able to determine which one it is from like the last 3 strings.
That's it.
Yeah.
Okay. A cool thing to know also is your blue note. So past this one on 6, up at 7.
Yeah, the one I ran into it.
Okay, so all you got to do is start by playing the note, the line, one in the cliche. So have a go. You don't have to do that fast either. You can just do it real slow. So don't start with the chord. Just
Yeah.
play the note from the start of it.
Oh god. No, that doesn't fit. No, that doesn't work.
That's out of this. Yeah. Well, your blue note, right? Your blue note is extremely tense, so like you want to have a good use of it. Or if you aren't going to do that, you want to use it as an ornamentation.
Yeah.
Like if you go.
Don't lead into the C.
See, that sounded cool.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just using the same 2 notes.
Hey, look. One of the things that we will talk about in the next lesson is how important motivic development is for improvisation. The biggest problem that I think a lot of people have with improvisation is that they think it's always got to be something new. And it really doesn't. And in fact, if you are doing always something new, audiences will find it really fatiguing. Right?
Because you're not having like a set idea that you can push in.
Yeah. So what you want to do is do an idea and then variations on that idea. So like, here's an idea, right? Okay, so simple 2-note idea. So if we take that idea, we might play that the same way twice even. Right? That starts sounding cool. It starts sounding like music because there's something for an audience to latch onto. If you go,
Yeah, it sounds kind of messy.
it's disjointed, you know. And that's not to say that there aren't places where that will work. Sometimes you want things to feel disjointed, but I think everybody that I've met in this course could spend a lot of time worrying about just making some good sounding simple melodies, even when they improvise. The more of that you focus in on, the more that your melodies that you try to make more interesting will work. And you get less of these instances where there's like, oh wow, that just sounded weird, or it just sounded like a non sequitur. Focusing in on basic functional melodies, just things that work and sound cool, and people might walk away humming. That is a really, really important step that most guitarists kind of want to bypass, right? Like they're like, you can see it a little bit with some of the more advanced players in this course, where they're like, this week I've been looking at chordal harmony, or this week I've been looking at doing this kind of scale and that kind of scale. And it's like, okay, that's all good stuff that you should continue doing. But unless you can thread together a melody that just sounds good by itself, then all of that stuff is just going to sound outside. It's going to sound weird and disjointed. What all of the most successful musicians for like the past 100 years have done is take strange concepts or foreign concepts and make them palatable to people. You know,
Mm.
so what you want to try to do is create solid melodies. And the more of the solid melody, the more of these kind of solid melodies you create. I really offended my cat just then. The more of these solid melodies you can create, the more likely that when you do things that are weirder, they will work better. It informs your ear about how do I tie a line off, which I'm sure is something that you've experienced. You know, like someone says, you know, oh, we're in Phrygian, so you did this run, and you're like, well, the run itself didn't sound too bad until I stopped, and like where I stopped, when I stopped,
Didn't sound right.
Didn't sound right. It's just like, oh, that felt strange. Like, why did my run sound bad? And it's usually, well, either they started bad or they ended bad, because the middle part of a run is just a connecting phrase. So the reason they sounded bad is because, well, you're not pulling yourself into chord tones. You're not hearing it. When you're playing, it's like your ears block for a second while you're thinking of. And what you really need to do is make sure that you come in and come out of a run in places that make sense harmonically. Otherwise, it just sounds like a scale exercise. Yeah, I'm not even trying to demonstrate that. Sometimes I really feel like I should just like record myself like practicing and improvising and just like upload it for people to like pick apart. Because I can, you know, annotate it with like, and this is when my run didn't work. This is where the run didn't work, and this is why. So don't be afraid of two notes, right? That is not a bad thing, right? When people start playing blues these days, I used to like start with, you know, here's your scale and let's learn a solo and all that kind of stuff. And I think, look, you want to play a blues song. Here's a solo.
Fun.
It's essentially one note, right? But it didn't sound bad, right? And most of the time, if you give someone a scale, what they end up doing is this.
Yeah, I find myself doing that, and I'm like, oh, it sounds like shit.
Yeah, and like it sounds like you're practicing scales, and it doesn't seem to relate to what's going on in the music. So here's a challenge for you: do a little backing track of yourself playing the blues. Choose one or two notes. The rule I always give to students is like you start on the root note, right? So we're in A, so I'm playing an A. And you keep playing that note until you hear either a note higher or a note lower. You know, and like more advanced concepts start coming more to your mind when you do that, because suddenly you're focusing on a different thing. Suddenly you're focusing on rhythm, and suddenly you're focusing just directly on how does this sound against the chords. So then you just worry about coming up one note, come up one note, come down one note in the scale. You know, maybe come up two notes. Next time round, try it on a different note. Experiment with rhythm. Experiment with phrasing. You know, if you feel like you're already past that point, choose four notes in the scale. You know, like. Right? Starting to sound more and more like a cool piece of music, right?
Hmm.
4 notes. All right, and that's before you worry. It's a bit like what I was saying about levels of detail and what's the point of learning scales. You've got 22 times 6 choices. That's too many. If I think about it in scale boxes, a scale box might only be 12 choices. 12 choices is a lot. If you had 12 choices of jam that you were trying to pick for your lunch this afternoon, that might be too many choices. Like, it might be too hard to make that choice. You might be worried about what happens. Why don't I get to choose some of this? Right? Choose less. Choose 1. Choose 4. Um, choose something that is containable inside your ear. Is the biggest thing. Like, if I choose these notes, right? So like it's like you can memorize those 4 notes really easily, so you've got a better idea of using your ear to dictate where you're going to use them.
Hmm.
Right? Which is one of the reasons why with beginner students I'm like, choose 1 note. And then when you hear the thing go up 1 note in the scale. When you hear the thing go down 1 note in the scale. And quite often what they hear in their head isn't quite what they think they hear. They're not very good at determining which pitch exactly it was. And that's fine, because you start learning what the pitch is by going da 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 da. Right? You just have to worry about going up or going down from that original pitch note.
Hmm.
And the cool thing about doing simple stuff is that the more of that you work on, the better and better and better and better your complicated stuff is going to sound. I wish someone had explained that to me when I was 14. Because I would be a much better player now had I been focusing on that instead of what I ended up focusing on, was just making things complicated.
Technique,
Big,
yeah.
flashy. Well, look, I'm not sad that I spend as much time sorting
Yeah.
out technique. Like, that has been really good. And even as an adult, even going through this kick of, oh man, I have been kind of focusing on the wrong things while I'm playing. I have still been drilling the crap out of technique, because I think of technique like I want an infinite trick bag next to me. And the
Hmm.
cool people don't just empty the trick bag onto the floor.
They have
They
things
like,
they pull out.
yeah,
Yeah.
like you're doing something that's not particularly tricky, and then you're like, whoa, look at this, and it's for a musical reason, right? The music got more tense or something, or more frantic, so I did too. But what I don't want to do is do what I normally do, which is like, oh god, somebody's watching me. I best empty my trick bag out in front of them to let them know I'm a decent player. Because what you end up sounding like is not a decent player. You end up sounding like someone who is a technically good player, but someone who doesn't know how to construct music.
Yeah.
So,
That's just me with slap. I'm like, oh, it's impressive.
yeah, it is honestly, and I'm not being cruel to that impulse.
Yeah.
I think that impulse serves the wrong function. Like, it doesn't make the music sound any better. Until it does. There will always be times where flashy shit really, that's like, oh man, that sounds great. In that
Satriani.
context. Yeah, there are tons of places where
God.
being
Steve Vai.
virtuosic,
Mm.
being virtuosic sounds amazing. However, both Satriani and Vai, and they're probably, I would think, the last generation of metal guitar heroes, if you even think of them
Yeah.
as that. They're kind of like weird, heavy classic rock in a weird way. But the last generation of guitar heroes who had an understanding of melody. You don't hear it very much anymore. That
Yeah, a lot of songs now is very just like technique based. If you look at like Tim Henson, Justin Abassi, all
yeah,
of them, yeah, they're very technique heavy.
yeah,
Like if you think about like Polyphia, yeah, and like was it like 40 ounces? It's all just like what is it? What's that called? Where you just like use
sweeping.
sweep picking, and I'm like, what the fuck am I like? This isn't a melody I
Yeah,
can hum.
yeah. One of the things that hit me years and years and years ago, I was teaching someone some Helix Nebula songs for their HSC, and it occurred to me, I was like, oh, this melody only makes sense at the speed it's played at, which is so fast, most people can't distinguish what the notes are between them. If you slow it down and you listen to the harmony and you compare the two things, it doesn't make any sense. Huge difference. If I speed Bach up to 10 times the speed it's supposed to be played on the page, it still sounds like music. Or if I slow it down half the speed it's supposed to be on the page, it still sounds like music. It just sounds like slow music, right? And I think in many ways, good music does tend to do that. There is a relationship, an inherently beautiful relationship between the pitches that people are playing in lead and people in rhythm. It is true of bebop, right? That, you know, if you slow bebop down, it still sounds pretty cool. You do have to get a little bit more comfortable lingering on certain dissonances because they use a lot of chromaticism. But because of the way that they hit that chromaticism, because of where in the bar it's being stressed, because of how they resolve out of it, it still sounds good when it's slow. Some of this text stuff, it's like, this has started as a finger exercise and it has ended as a fast finger exercise that's been put to, you know, double kicks going crazy. And that, look, it could also be my age and not understanding the genre, but I don't necessarily think it's that, because there are lots of modern music that I find very appealing. It's just
what's his name again?
Tim Henson. I keep thinking it's Tim Henson, like Jim Henson. It's Henderson, isn't it?
Jimmy. No, that's Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah. You were right. I think it's Tim Henderson. He's a great example. Every now and then, I think he plays something that's really interesting.
I was thinking of Tim Henson, like Polyphia.
Yeah. That's who I'm thinking of. Sorry. He pops up in my feed occasionally. I click on his videos, and one of the
very flashy guitar. Very.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Very flashy guitar.
Very impressive. He has this prevalence for tapped notes, and I have a personal preference against tapped notes because I don't think they sound very good. They have a weird, plunkety, hollow, almost out of tune quality to them. Like, it's like the harmonics that get generated aren't very nice. So...
Yeah, it's very flat. But sometimes I like how it sounds.
Hey, all of these things, right, are tricks and expressive techniques that should be used in moderation. I can't tell you how cool it was when breakdowns first started entering music. Right? It's like, wow, that is a cool thing. And yeah, it sounds heavy. It sounds fat. Like, I can't remember. I think one of the first songs I taught with a complicated breakdown was Slipknot's Duality, back when it first came out. And before then, it was entering pop culture with things like, what's that band? My Bloody Valentine and things like that were using them. And they did sound big and fat and heavy. But man, it got overused. Every song had to have a breakdown in it. Every song's breakdown had to have, like, it's not like you ended up just shopping for the weirdest rhythm sets you could. And it's like, that then is not music for an expressive purpose. It's music to play Sudoku. Like, you know, like, it's music as an algorithmic game I'm playing.
The one that, like, one of the guitars I really like recently has really kind of melodic lines. Mattias Asato.
Oh, Mattias Asato, yeah.
Yeah, God. I listen to it, I'm like, oh.
He is a cool player who
feel my body in it.
A lot. And like, okay, here's a great example of where some of the runs he uses, you're like, that's a scale exercise. You did the pentatonic scale just then. But that's not in itself a bad thing. Pentatonic scales are inherently musical, and where he puts them in the song or in his improvisation feels really good. And it's not like it just feels frantic for no reason. It's like he's extremely clean, and the line makes this kind of beautiful cascade. So I think that's really different to Tim Henson, where sometimes when you hear Tim Henson play, you're like, you've come up with something that is angular and strange, and I think that's kind of where you started. I want something to sound weird, you know, rather than focusing on it sounding musical. So what was that Mattias one? I should check it out after the lesson.
Mattias Asato, just anything, him. Very good guitar.
You mentioned a particular one, didn't you?
I don't think I mentioned a particular one. Like, if I were to think of one, his Fireflies one's really nice.
His Firefly one?
He did a cover of Fireflies by Al City. It sounds
Right,
really
right.
nice. And I'm like, oh,
Yeah,
oh,
I mean, look, Matteo Sasato's his technique and his tone choices are really really nice. Um, you know, so all of this, and I would also say Matteo Sasato. One of the things that makes him so nice as a player is how melodic his playing is.
that's what I'm saying. It's very melody driven, everything.
Yeah, and the flash comes in to support the thing he's doing melodically, right?
Hmm.
So I think aiming for those kind of ideas. Um, sorry, my mum was just calling my cat to
Or
make
my
sure
mom
that
was
she's
messaging me to have lunch.
right. Yeah. So I think a good challenge for you as a musician, right, is take any of these chord progressions off the page,
Hmm.
make something melodic out of them. The framework for doing that will either be your modes, the most difficult thing, that is the hardest one by far. Your pentatonic scales, less difficult, right, but can be equally difficult.
Hmm.
If you're going to use pentatonic scales, I would try to either shift pentatonic scale with each chord. So you play C to F, you play C pentatonic and F pentatonic.
Yeah.
Or what I would do is add an F note to the C pentatonic. Like I would add the notes of the chord to the C pentatonic.
I usually just go from C to F because I'm always like, oh. But like the problem when I try and do that is now I have to figure it out beforehand, which one's which, and then I can go into it.
Yeah, that will happen less and less and less the more you hit this as a thing. So like
Yeah.
like in my private lessons, that might be a couple of months worth of work. We might just sit down and do lots of different chord progressions where we take a look at how do we think about finding these notes in the scale? Like where is the root note of this pentatonic? So one of the sheets I think I gave out last year, or I might have put in the Dropbox folder, is pentatonic off each string. Um, so like this pentatonic, which we associate with G, right? Little stretch, big stretch, right?
It's
Right.
very
Well, if we go to yeah,
was
it's
it
kind of like
hillbilly? Yeah.
yeah. Well, okay. Here, this chord. Oh, here's the root note. Anywhere we go from the root note, little stretch, big stretch, big stretch. Here's another root. Little stretch, big stretch, big stretch. Right? And so anywhere you find the root note of a pentatonic, if you go little stretch, big stretch, big stretch, you do have to figure out.
Yeah.
You do have to kind of figure out the little differences about is it a fret back or fret up because of
It's
this
just
or that.
like between these two strings, it's always like it's never you move
The
like the
last
one
of the
up.
two strings go up one fret.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that's one way of looking at it, right? But another way of looking at it would be so one note you cross over and do tone spacing. So if we take that root note again, right, that's the same. Tone space, cross a string. And things like that can help a lot because you go, I'm playing C to an F, right? C to an F. So C, F, C, F. So it becomes easy to start visualizing it on the neck when you make those observations. There you go, right? And you can hear it, right? And this is why an observation like that is powerful because you're like, okay, now if I just use my ear to fix the last 5% of information, I'll be fine. Another way of doing exactly the same thing, right, would have been to think, well, here's my C chord, right? So if I then impose an F chord on that, the only notes that are outside the scale different are these two F notes.
Yeah.
So another way of thinking about it would be I could play in C. Just use the F. Add the F to the scale I'm already playing. It's same with this G chord, right? So when we look at G, the only note that's not inside that C pentatonic is this B note. Okay, so on the F chord I add an F, on the G chord I add a B, and that will start sounding like the chords.
It's a lot harder trying to hear the difference between the 1 and 4, like where the chord changes. It's just 1 and 4 are just so similar.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why hitting that F is a good thing, because the F sounds odd. It sounds like a sus4 against the 1 chord, right?
Mm.
So as soon as you hear that F, you immediately are going to start associating it with F, because it's the root note of the key. So little tricks like that, they're the kind of things that I would spend a couple of months developing with the students, so they start feeling comfortable with this approach, this way of looking at pentatonics, starting to use them to solo with. And quite often what happens then is they get to a certain point where they're like, okay, but there are other sounds in this universe that pentatonic ain't doing for me. And that's when you start branching out somewhere else, you know? You might do a couple of months just working on triads, where you're like, how do I make melodies out of something so simple? Out of something that's only 3 note choices. So what you've got to do is take these chord progressions and do some of those exercises. For the test, which is coming up in a couple of weeks,
Shit.
right? You want to focus mostly on triads. This test is going to be mostly on triads.
Is it triads across the entire fretboard?
Yeah, I'm going to be probably pretty kind and restrict all of the reading examples and probably most of the playing examples to the key of C. But there might be something in there where there's like, eight chords from a chord progression written out and be like, play it in triads, then play it with triads and extensions. Something like that. Essentially, if it hasn't been covered, I'm not going to do anything that hasn't been covered in some of the lessons up to now. So there'll be a little bit of sight reading. There'll probably be a little bit of improvisation. There'll be a lot of stuff on show me your triads, show me this chord in three inversion shapes. You know, so you do need to know your inversions. You do need to be comfortable, I would say, at least in the key of C. So a little bit of work. Need a little bit of work.
Oh.
It should have been root position.
Oh. There you go. Wrong one.
Look, next week there's a reading exercise, which is what I sent you last night. So you can take a look at that if you want. This is a concept about outer voice movement and inner voice movement, where we take a scale and we play the triads underneath the scale where it lines up. And then we do that with the 1, 4, and 5 chords. What do I do? And then you take that as a concept and you go, okay, well, if I improvise a melody, that was all on the top voice, by the way, that they also do it on the middle voice and the lower voice of a triad. Then if I improvise a melody, I should kind of get trying to use motivic development, trying to use something that makes it sound make sense, improvise, supporting myself with those chords. Right? Making melodic and sensible music choices. The whole point of that exercise is, and obviously you've got to do it on 3 voices, you've got to do it in the middle voice and then the low voice. The whole point of that is that your melody needs to kind of announce where the chords are going and coming. Right? So that melody, you know, change chord, right? Da da dee da 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 da. That note is going to be the 4 chord. Right?
Nice.
Start developing ideas. Start making things that sound. At the moment, we're aiming for cheesy, right? We're aiming for things that sound really predictable and normal. Again, because focusing on that stuff drives home how to do the complicated stuff in a way that makes sense.
Gotcha.
Than, you know, this isn't the end goal, but the more of the, like, I can't tell you how profitable it's been for me in the past couple of years to focus on making melodies like that. Because now when I'm jamming, I gotta say it has actually created a small problem where if I'm jamming with someone and I go back to the way I used to play with just kind of like not paying too much attention and playing scales, I really don't feel very good about it. And I get quite down on myself for doing it. So it has changed that, which is irritating. I'm sure that'll go away in a year or two through working this way, and I'll actually end up being a much better player. But what it does mean is that when I am paying attention, I'm making stuff that sounds much nicer, sounds together with the music, and even when I'm doing stuff that moves a lot or is more complicated. And it's because I've programmed my brain with all of these. Okay, this is a way that sounds consonant to get this melody out. I'm paying attention to the shape of the melody, and the melody is going this way, so I have to make it feel like it goes this way, rather than the melody, the chords are going this way, and I'm just like, yeah, I'll do whatever I want.
Jeez.
So, list of chord progressions, playing with your triads, playing with your scales, and what you're aiming to do after the most basic points. If you're doing 1 to 4, you might start with just playing your 1 and 4 chord in all of your inversions. But after that point, you want to try to make a musical somehow. And that could be like. Right, because that sounded more musical than me going. And as soon as you can turn all of these concepts into something that is musical, 1, the more fun you'll have, but 2, you'll start programming the right kind of things into your hands. And your mind, too.
Damn. All right. Wait, so when is the exam?
Well, you're in B week, right? So the exam. So B week is next week, technically. Right?
What?
And it's not the exam, that's the last class. That'll be lesson 5.
Ah, yeah.
All right. So we have to work out another time to do lesson 5. I don't know if I can do Wednesday next week. We'll have to have a chat about that. Then after next week, there would be 2 more weeks, and that would be the exam.
Yeah.
All right. So you've got about 3 weeks.
Gotcha. Yeah, next week's gonna be a bit weird. Like, it's because they set it up weird.
Yeah, every year they do this where right near the end of term, one of my classes gets interfered with the lecture.
I could just like skip on half the lecture part.
Well, like it only depends on how it's going to impact. Now, another option too is that we could do our lesson at 10.
10. 10.
Don't worry, I feel the same way about it. Like, oh,
I barely got up for today.
Yeah. Or we could do it after the lecture ends, potentially, depending on how many classes you got after that.
Well, the lecture ends at 5.
What? It goes from 1 till 5?
So what happened is, for some reason, they mixed 2 classes together, and it's like, so there's a lecture from basically 1 till 2:30 to 3, and then from there we have time with our groups,
right,
to work on it. So it's basically from 1, for me at least, it's 1 to 4:30.
Right, okay. What's the rest of your week look like? Monday, Thursday, Friday?
Let me get my timetable up.
I mean, I seriously doubt the other people in this class. There's 2 other people in this class, and they haven't responded to any of my emails. So they ain't gonna do so well in this test, which means they're just handing 20% of their grade away. Which is like, why are you paying tens of thousands of dollars for this education?
To not use it.
To phone it in. Like, so many people should have gap years.
Well, like, I know people who like just go into uni because they have to, or like they want to, but then it's like they're not as motivated anymore. It's really weird. I know people
Yeah,
who just go into it just to like have the social aspect, and I'm like, fair enough.
yeah, yeah, and they're all kind of valid things for different reasons. The thing that I think is strange though in music is to have so little passion. Like I couldn't tell you. Like maybe it's because of when I grew up and the access to information when I grew up. But if someone had sat me down and been given me the kind of stuff that's done in this course and then the rest of your course, I would have eaten it with a goddamn spoon. Like I can't tell you how hungry I was for information as a teenager and as a younger person. I still am. I still am that involved, but I also have way more interests and responsibilities now than I did at a younger age. So like for example, information was so rare that I got two back-to-back lessons with a friend of the family who was studying at ANU, and I had to learn all 7 of my mode fingerings overnight. But I did that when I was 14. That's how much I cared about information. It was just like that night became, I have a lesson tomorrow, and in order to understand that lesson, I need to know this stuff. Okay, get it
The
done.
thing, like now, I'm like, I feel like shit when like I'm not motivated.
Yeah,
Like these past few weeks, it's like on and off with guitar. I'm like
I would
playing it,
also,
but like not really.
yeah, look, I would say that you have to be empathetic with yourself too. I went through a huge dead period of like, I don't know, 8 to 10 years where I didn't really work on developing myself in the way I should have.
Hmm.
I was really depressed. Like that was really hard. I was finding that guitar, which used to really help me with depression, started kind of impacting it and making it worse.
Because you're thinking about it, you're like, I could be
Yeah,
doing this.
yeah, because I'm shitting on myself, right? Like, so there is a certain amount of if you are stressed, if you have a lot of other crap in your life, this is a lifelong pursuit. So
Hmm.
a week here or there ain't going to matter any difference to the 60 years you might end up playing. So you do have to have empathy. The one difficulty is, of course, being in an institution, there is a gun to your head about you've got to get this stuff
Yeah.
done now. And also, if you don't get this stuff done, your marks won't be very good. In music, no one has literally ever asked me for my marks, or most of the time my
Mhm.
qualifications.
It's just P's get degrees. Just as long as you
So,
pass, you're fine.
yeah, yeah, and
I was thinking about it like last semester. There was an assignment, and then I had enough marks to where I would have passed, but I just didn't do the assignment. And I was like, I'll do the assignment.
the important part, the important thing is pulling what you need out of the education, right?
Hmm.
You are here to learn, so you better make sure some of that is happening.
That's why I'm like, if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna at least try everything.
Yeah,
Do everything. That's why, like, even in classes, if I'm gonna answer a question, even if it's wrong, I don't care.
yeah, and it's a good attitude to have. Like, um, I think there are some people in this course at the moment that probably needed to wait a few years to come to uni.
Hmm.
A lot of people, if you come straight out of high school, I think you have this idea that there's too much of a correlation between what you do at high school and what you do at uni. Um, and that's not really the case.
Hmm.
The thing I find strange about it, though, is in music, everyone had to be a self-educator at some point. So you had to have some kind of passion and drive. So where did that go? Um,
God, I remember like my first interaction with music lessons was like when I was a kid and I did drums at like
hey,
PCYC.
that is not a bad place to start. Drums is cool.
But then the thing is, I dropped it after like 2, 3 months
Yeah.
because my mom forced it down me. Like, I think there was a time where she locked me in a room until I learned drum patterns using pillows because we couldn't afford drums.
That's harsh.
So like
I mean,
after a while, I just dropped it, and I'm like I couldn't do it. And I picked up music again in like year 9 because I was like, oh, piano's fun.
yeah, yeah. And look, that's the other side of the coin too, is that being forced to do something never
Hmm.
really like
Now
the
I
hardest thing.
now like I look back and I wish I still did drums.
Yeah, yeah. I think the hardest thing to understand when you're younger is that a lot of the time when people do these things to you, it's because they have a life experience and they're like, if you
Hmm.
get yourself in the right headspace, and that's all it is. It's a headspace of stop bucking against this and just pay some attention to it, you'll probably find there's something really interesting and fun there. And it's something I have a lot of hard time
That's the
getting
thing.
to.
Like I would have had fun with drums. And I know I would have. It's just the way my mom went about making me do the drums. Nah.
Yeah, yeah. And as soon as you poison the well, like it's a
Mm.
hard thing. I've got a couple of students at the moment. I have a drum student at the moment where she does it to herself. The second she makes a mistake, she gets really angry and gets upset. And I'm like, you can't keep doing this, because if you keep doing this, there is absolutely no way you can enjoy this.
Mm.
You have to learn how to push
Whiplash
that limit.
time.
Yeah, like that dude is crazy. that band conductor. Um, all right, so we still have to find a time slot for next week.
Next Monday at 1.
Yeah, I could probably do that next Monday one.
Because I have a class at 10, 11, but then like I have like a 3-hour gap.
Okay, next Monday at one.
Next Monday at
All right.
1.
I figure I'll probably just send the invite out to everyone in this class anyway, because the
Yeah.
other two people, like I said, didn't respond, so it'll probably just be another individual thing.
I was gonna say something. Sure, I was gonna say
If you can,
something
it would
dumb.
be good to try to play around with some of those concepts that we talked about today between now and then.
Yeah.
And if you want to get a head start on it, have a look at that lesson 5 sheet, like reading through the sheet.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
God, it's so close to the end of this semester already.
Yeah, it's funny how it's almost like your body knows how close to the end of the semester it is, because like you get fatigued by it. And you're
It's
like,
not even that.
I'm
It's
ready for a
like
break.
I was so prepared for this next 4 years of uni, and I was like, it's gonna take ages. I'm gonna have to, and then it's already done with the first year, and I'm like, what happened? I've been inside the entire time.
Well, yeah, it's also been a weird 18 months, or a weird 2 years.
Weird. I remember I was thinking of taking a gap year before
Yeah.
uni, and I was thinking about it. I was like, it sounds like a good idea, but like, I don't really know about it. And I'm like, if I'm gonna take a gap year, I'm gonna take a gap year after uni. Because I'm thinking like I'll have the qualifications, and I'll be like, that's good. I can like be comfortable in my head that I'm like, yes.
Yeah. I don't think necessarily. I don't necessarily think that you're one of the people that needed to take a gap year. You've got the right kind of attitude towards learning, and you still seem to find a way of having fun with it. So like they're the people that I think really struggle. Is they feel like, just like high school, you turn up and tick the boxes,
Mm.
and you don't invest yourself into it, and you don't challenge yourself to learn new things, or put some time in to actually do the shit that you need to do. They're the people that I think, oh man, you should have gone into the workforce for 2, 3, maybe 5 years, and then learned how special it is to be in a space in your life where you're like, all I have to do is study. Like,
That's my thought. It's like I can like kind of still lay back these next few
yeah,
years studying. Even in that gap year
it's a weirdly
that I'm
protected
planning,
environment.
I want to study more things.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go. I'm planning on, at least if it goes to plan, doing a luthier course.
Oh, nice.
So I do a lot of
Um,
making stuff in anyway. I'm like, might as well put it to use,
well, I mean, like, yeah, when you have time, it is a fun hobby to get into.
Oh yeah,
If I were you,
I love woodworking, all that anyway.
before you jump straight into lutherie, I would suggest what you look into really heavily is guitar repair.
Yeah. Well, it's like I wanted to start like a course which teaches me how to do all that stuff.
But even before the course, right? One of the things that you really want to get your head around is setup and the mechanical problems of the guitar, because the thing that's going to make like, a lot of people can build things that are pretty decent instruments, but a lot of the polish is left off, and the polish is really understanding, say, the geometry of action, the geometry of how you set the guitar up. So some good things to, if you have spare time, to look into is like Dan Erlewin's books. He's got some complete repair guides and things like that. People like Frank Ford. There's a great luthier on YouTube called Twoford, TWO Ford. He's really, really good. There's a whole bunch of them online. So if you start watching that kind of stuff and just get an idea of how these things structure together, when you hit the course, you'll hit the ground running, and it won't be so like.
Like I already want to start messing around with this guitar and like fucking around with what's inside, but I'm also like, I paid money for this.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't want to mess it up.
um, well, look, if you have spare time, write me an email about the kind of things you're interested in doing.
Okay.
I'm more than happy to chat about what to do, you know, because I'm a luthier, because I make stuff.
You do everything. I'm just like hearing things. It's like, oh wow, you're a drummer. Nice.
So I do, you know, I build acoustic guitars and electric guitars and refrets, and I can't tell you how valuable it was for me to have this background in understanding the setup in a thorough way, so that when I started making instruments, one of the strangest things when you make an instrument is quite often the first time it has strings on it, sounds like shit.
Because like everything would be wrong, like all the measurements, everything.
Well, I mean, yes and no. Like if you've done your job really well, then they're pretty close. But if you haven't done your levels, if you haven't done a setup, if you haven't fully carved the nut and things like that, then you play it and you're trying to look through all of the cloud to go, yeah, there's something nice underneath all of that. And the first
how do I make it nice?
Yeah, the first couple of times I made an instrument, you'd string it together, and there's a moment where I'm like, what the fuck have I done? I spent months creating this abomination. And then you dial it in, and you're like, oh, actually,
yeah, it's like at least along the way you figured out like, oh, I'm doing this. It's going somewhere. At least I know where I'm going.
So, yeah, I'd be happy to talk you through all that kind of stuff. There is, you can get very cheap guitar kits, which are a great thing to experiment with. You know, like I think $180 you can get like a Tele or a Strat kit that are kind of okay guitars, but most of what you have to do to those things is setup work, and understanding, you know, neck angle and things like that. How
yeah, I've looked into a lot of that and like figuring out when I see people in videos why they go like this. And I'm like,
if they do that, they're sighting it from the wrong end. You want to sight it?
Yeah, well, something like that. But I'm like, now it makes sense because you're looking at like if the neck is like bowed in or shit like that. And I'm like,
and knowing what a right option is, right? Like dead straight is usually not a right option.
You need it like curved in a bit.
Yeah, you need it to bow. You want the string to have excess height.
Excess height at the bottom. Yeah.
But then there's other tricks too. Like you need the neck to bow forward slightly, and then quite often you need the frets to bevel away on the last, say, 5 or 6 frets.
Or else it'll rattle.
Yeah, and it's all about, well, on a bolt-on guitar like that, part of the problem is that the bolts themselves pull back on the wood so hard you can actually bow the fretboard up. Especially if someone's used a drill to put the neck bolts in, which usually over tightens the neck bolts. And that's a weird idea because you need the thing to be so tight it doesn't move, but you don't need it over tightened to the point where you've started encouraging the wood to deform. So quite often there's like a 14th fret to a 16th fret hump in guitars, where... I should see that
in mine. Mine's a little bit... I should probably fix mine.
Yeah,
honestly.
Starting with fixing your own guitars up is a good place to be.
I've been doing that for a while now already. Yeah. Like I've been messing around with the tremolo bar, like height.
Yeah,
I'm like, do I want a floating bridge? Do I not? I've realized I've messed around with the floating bridge. I don't want it anymore.
I can't, like, my Strat bridge is not blocked, so I can bend down, but the springs are up so hard that if I bend a string, the bridge doesn't move.
I also run into an issue which pisses me off, where I think it has to do with the nut, but it's not lubricated enough anymore. And whenever I use the whammy bar, I hear like a kink, and I'm like, oh, fuck.
Oh yeah. If you hear pings, that means that the nut slot
it's not lubed
too narrow.
Too narrow.
So usually, like, you know, once you get into lutherie, there's like a good $1,000 worth of tools you probably want to buy to start with, and that's before you get into the woodworking tools. But one good trick for that, if you don't have the gauged files,
pencil,
slots, soft graphite pencil.
Soft graphite pencil. So that's what I was trying to do, and it wasn't really working properly. I'm like, I probably don't have the right pencil.
Yeah, I mean, even an HP pencil will help. Just you've got to really color the slot in and make sure that there's plenty of. You should see black powder all through the slot.
Yeah.
However, if your nut is plastic is extremely grippy.
I think mine is plastic.
Yeah, plastic. I don't like plastic as a nut. One, it doesn't sound as good. Two, it's not very hard and it is a little rubbery. And because it's rubbery, especially as the strings.
Yeah, I
warm,
realized
slots.
over time it's cut in the strings.
Yeah. Yeah, and that happens too because plastic's rather soft. But as the string cuts in, it makes a groove that's exactly the size of the string.
And then you have to like fucking shave it down more.
Yeah, you have to open that slot up a little bit. So one trick you could try on the one that's pinging is you get some like 1,000 grit sandpaper or 800 grit sandpaper, fold it over, and just
And
do
put it in.
two swipes, leaning back towards the headstock. Right? You
So
don't
like
want
inward.
Yeah, so like if your nut's here, you want to go back towards the headstock. Probably start flat and then round towards the headstock. Whatever you don't want to do is you don't want to create an up ramp.
Because that'll just screw it over.
The end of the nut slot back, so you end up changing your intonation slightly. Not by a huge amount, but that's one thing that you could try to help decrease that pinging.
Yeah.
Is just fold over a piece of sandpaper and just run it through the nut. Anyway, write me an email. I'm more than happy to chat about that kind of stuff. And any help you need getting going. It's good fun stuff. Like I've got a couple of students where I've been teaching them. Like one guy I was teaching him how to make instruments instead of he came for mandolin lessons and ended up doing lutherie.
It's good fun, just like messing around with it. Just like sitting there and just touching everything. You're like, oh, fun.
Yeah. Like I think as a guitarist, you want to know how every component on this thing works because all of it has some impact on playability or tone. And it's through understanding all of those elements together that like you can really get something better.
Yeah, like recently I've been messing around with pickup height.
Oh yeah, that's a big one. And too close to the strings creates some weird sounds because you create secondary like harmonics where the string doesn't vibrate properly, so you get these overtones that are just awful.
I remember I put it up too high once, and then like the string, when I would put down a fret, it would start to touch the thing. I'm like, that's not right.
Yeah, but I think even depending on the pickup, depending on the strength of the magnet, inside of 2 millimeters quite often means that when you pick the higher frets where the string actually gets closer, and inside of 2 millimeters means when you fret the last fret, if the pole piece is inside of 2 millimeters, you're touching the string. So let's say it was 1 millimeter. When you pick up there, you'll get this weird broken bell sound. You get the note that you're after, and then some other weird note that is really dissonant to the one you're playing.
Very odd.
Anyway, I gotta run. So
I gotta go have lunch.
So next Monday at 1. Awesome.
Yep, Monday at 1.
Cool, man.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Whoa.